Montana Territory, June 1883. The stagecoach rocked over the last rise into the dusty town of Dry Creek just before dusk, and Beatrice Bellamy clutched her valise tighter, heart hammering against her ribs. She was packed for a mail order wedding she never wanted. The letter in her pocket crinkled as she shifted. It smelled faintly of tobacco and desperation. Claiborne Wicks, the man who sent for her, was a widower with 2 sons, a general store, and a reputation for being steady enough. She had agreed because there was no one left in Ohio to stop her. Her mother was buried last winter, her father long dead, and the boarding house she once worked in had closed. She needed a place to land. Still, her hands trembled. Dry Creek was smaller than she expected. Just a handful of buildings huddled against the prairie, a church steeple, and the clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoing down the main road. She stepped down from the stagecoach, skirts brushing the dirt, and scanned the street for Claiborne. "You Beatrice?" a deep voice asked behind her. She turned to find a tall man on a bay gelding, dust coating his boots and hat. His shirt was wrinkled, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he had the kind of jaw a woman could trust, strong, sun-weathered, a little stubborn. But it was his eyes that caught her. Hazel, edged with green, and full of something fierce. "Yes," she said slowly. "I am." He nudged his horse closer. "You are not marrying Claiborne Wicks." She blinked. "I beg your pardon." The man dismounted in one smooth motion and took off his hat. "Name's Holden James. You are coming with me instead." Her mouth went dry. "I do not know you." "I know. But I know you." His voice was calm, low. "You were born in Dayton. Your father was a schoolteacher. You used to sneak into the county fair with a red ribbon in your hair. You cried the day your older brother left for the war." Her chest tightened. "Holden." He gave a small nod. "You were 12. I was 15. We used to race sticks in the creek behind your house." "I thought you died," she whispered. "We heard your regiment was wiped out at Cold Harbor." "I nearly did," he said, voice rough. "But I did not." She stared at him. The lanky boy she remembered was gone. He had grown into himself, taller, broader, quiet in a way that settled deep. "But why would you come now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because I found your name on the mail order registry in Helena," he said. "Because I could not let you marry a man like Claiborne Wicks." Beatrice looked down the road and spotted Claiborne stepping out of the general store. He was older than she expected, gray at the temples, a hard edge to his mouth even from this distance. A boy stood beside him, maybe 9 or 10, dragging a stick through the dirt. "I made a promise to him," she said quietly. "Did he make one to you?" Holden asked. "Did he promise kindness? Safety? Love?" She said nothing. "I came for you, Bea," Holden said, voice low. "I have a ranch outside of town. It is not much, but it is honest. You would have a room of your own, a warm stove, a garden if you want one. And me. You would have me." Beatrice looked at the road ahead and the man who waited. Then she looked back at Holden. Her breath caught. "Do you have a wagon?" "I have a horse," he said. "And room for you." She hesitated only a second longer, then handed him her valise. They rode out of Dry Creek before the sun finished setting. Holden's ranch sat nestled beneath the rising curve of the foothills, backed by pine and quiet. A simple house, a corral, and a barn. The air smelled of sage and fresh hay. He helped her down from the horse and reached for her hand without asking. When his fingers closed around hers, the weight of every year between them dropped away. "I still cannot believe it is you," she said as they stepped into the house. "I never stopped thinking about you," he said, "even when I thought I was dying." The inside was clean, simple. A fire crackled in the hearth. The kitchen table had 2 chairs. One was turned outward, as if waiting. "I will sleep in the barn tonight," Holden said gently, "until you decide what you want." "I am not afraid of you," she said. "Not one bit." He looked at her, quiet. "I know who you are, Holden James," she added. "You never lied when we were children. I do not think you know how." A small smile touched his face. "You remember that?" "I remember everything." That night, Beatrice lay in the small bed with fresh linens and stared at the worn beam above her head. The wind moved outside. She heard the soft sound of Holden brushing down the horse, the way he whistled low under his breath. It reached her like a lullaby. She touched the ribbon she had tucked in her valise, the same red one she wore the summer before he left. When morning came, she stepped outside and found him splitting wood near the barn. Shirt off, sweat down his back, every muscle working. He paused when he saw her. "I will stay," she said. Holden dropped the axe, crossed the distance, and pulled her into his arms. "I will make a life with you," she whispered into his chest. "You already are," he said, and when he leaned down, their kiss was not hurried. It was years of waiting, of remembering, of finding each other again. The wind swept around them. The past fell away, and the future, steady and strong, began exactly where they stood. The morning after Beatrice chose to stay, Holden hitched the mule and wagon before sunup. The light hadn't yet spilled over the hilltops, and the grass bore a silver sheen of dew. She came out with her sleeves rolled and her hair pinned up, the edges of her apron still damp from rinsing out the wash basin. "I'll need to go into town today," he said, looping the harness. "Fence boards are near gone along the north line. Thought you might want to come." Beatrice glanced toward the hills, considering. "Will we pass that dry creek by the cottonwoods?" "Only way in," he said. "I'd like that." He helped her up beside him without a word. The wagon eased into motion with a creak of wood and the low grunt of the mule. The land stretched wide and golden, and the silence between them felt easy. She kept her eyes on the horizon. "Have you been back east since the war?" "No," he said. "Didn't feel like there was anything for me there anymore. I thought about going back to Dayton this spring," she said softly. "But the lot where our house stood is now a cooper's yard. The creek's dried out. Nothing left to go home to." Holden didn't answer right away. His hand rested on the reins, firm and steady. "Sometimes home's not where you came from. It's where someone waits for you." Beatrice looked at him then, the brim of his hat casting shadow across his cheek. "Were you waiting for me?" He didn't look away from the road. "Yes." When they reached the general store, Beatrice stayed in the wagon while Holden went inside. The door shut behind him with a hollow clap. She watched the street, quieter than the day before. A woman swept her porch across the way, and a dog lay sprawled beside the saloon steps. No sign of Claiborne. A boy wandered up from the alley between buildings, dragging a stick through the dust. His shirt was patched at the elbows, and he had the same stubborn tilt to his jaw as the man from yesterday. "You're the lady from the coach," he said, stopping a few paces from the wagon. "You were supposed to marry my pa." Beatrice folded her hands in her lap. "Yes, I was." He kicked at a pebble. He wasn't mad, just real quiet. Said folks don't always do what they promise. Don't think he liked saying it. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "What's your name?" "Thomas," he muttered. "They call me Tom." She gave a small nod. "Tom, I hope your father finds someone who's right for him." He shrugged, eyes on his boots. "He don't laugh much. Maybe he needs someone who makes him." Holden came out then, a bundle of boards balanced on his shoulder. He paused when he saw Tom, and the boy looked up at him, wary. Holden gave a small nod of greeting, then loaded the boards into the back of the wagon. Beatrice turned to Tom again. "Take care of your brother," she said. He squinted at her. "How'd you know I had one?" "I saw you with him yesterday." Tom scratched his arm, then walked off without another word. On the way back, the wind picked up over the ridge, cool against the back of her neck. "Did you know he'd come speak to me?" she asked. Holden shook his head. "Didn't expect it." "He's got his father's pride. He's got his father's eyes," she said. Holden didn't reply, but his jaw set slightly as he guided the mule around a rut in the road. Later, they unloaded the boards near the north fence. Holden handed her his gloves, and she held the post straight while he dug. The silence between them felt different now, thicker, but not uneasy. "I've never set a fence before," she said. "You're doing fine." Her hands ached before they'd finished 5 posts, but she didn't complain. As the sun lowered, they sat side by side in the grass, a canteen between them. "You're not what I expected," she said, watching a hawk circle overhead. "Good or bad?" "Neither. Just different." She paused. "Stronger." Holden looked down at his hands. "Pain does that. Or it breaks you." Beatrice didn't speak for a while. Then she leaned back on her elbows and looked at the sky. "I think I'd like to plant something. Near the kitchen window. Maybe beans or carrots." He looked over at her, something warming in his eyes. "I'll clear the ground for you tomorrow." She nodded once. "I'll do the rest." They sat there as the light softened, not touching, but close enough to feel the other's breath move. When night came, she didn't ask him to stay inside, but she left the door unlatched. The rain came 3 days later, sudden and cold, beating down from a sky that had held nothing but blue since spring. Beatrice stood barefoot in the doorway, watching it soak the earth in long, silver strokes. The garden rows she'd dug were dark with mud, the neat mounds softened by the downpour. She didn't mind. The land needed it. Holden came in from the barn, dripping wet, his hat slung low and boots leaving prints across the floor. He set the lantern on the table and pulled off his coat. "That creek won't stay dry much longer," he said, running a hand through his hair. "We'll have to watch it. Water comes fast off the hills." She nodded, drying her hands on her skirt. "I set a pot to boil. Thought I'd make that cornmeal porridge you used to eat when we were young." "I remember," he said, voice quiet. "Your mother used to stir it with her left hand because her right wrist never healed right." Beatrice looked up from the hearth, startled. "You noticed that?" "I noticed everything about you back then," he said, sitting at the table. "I just didn't have the words yet." She kept stirring. The room filled with the smell of salt and corn and rain-slick air. It was a simple meal, but it warmed them. When they finished, Holden leaned back in his chair, running a thumb over the rim of his tin cup. "You always knew how to wait out a storm," he said. Beatrice turned from the window. "I didn't have much choice." He looked up at her, eyes steady. "You do now?" She sat across from him. "I've never been anyone's wife, Holden. I don't know what I'm supposed to be." "I'm not asking you to be anything but yourself," he said. "And if that's not enough someday, it already is." She looked down at her hands, calloused from digging, the skin beneath her nails dark with soil that hadn't yet rinsed clean. "Then I'll stay." Holden didn't answer, but he reached across the table, his hand closing gently over hers. The next morning broke clear, the air sharp from the storm. The creek had swelled just as Holden said it would, carrying thin brown water past the cottonwoods. Beatrice stood near it, arms crossed, boots sinking slightly into the softened ground. "I was thinking," she said when Holden joined her, "I could teach reading to the children on the outlying ranches, if their families are willing." Holden tilted his head. "You were always the only one who could sit still long enough to learn your letters." She smiled without looking at him. "That's not true. You used to copy your sister's schoolwork so you could read the almanac." He gave a low chuckle. "I never figured you knew about that." "I knew." She paused. "I think there's more I could do here. More than just keeping a house. You don't need my permission." "I know I don't. But I want your thoughts." Holden glanced toward the hills. "There's a family west of here. The Garlands. Got 4 young ones and barely time to keep them fed, much less taught. If you want, I'll ride out with you next week. Make introductions." Beatrice nodded. "Thank you." They walked the edge of the water in silence, the grass still damp. She moved slower than usual, thoughtful, as though measuring each step. "Did you ever think, back then," she said finally, "that we'd end up here?" "No," he said, "but I hoped." She stopped. "I didn't expect to be wanted again. Not like this." Holden turned to face her. "You're not a burden to carry, Bea. You're the reason I built this place the way I did. I just didn't know it at the time." She stepped closer, the breeze catching the edge of her shawl. "I want to marry you, Holden. Not for shelter. Not for safety. Just because I want you." He didn't answer with words. He took her face in his hands, his touch reverent, and kissed her with the slow certainty of a man who'd made up his mind years ago. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. "Will you let me make a white dress?" she asked softly. "Even if it's just me sewing it in the evenings?" "You can wear your apron and muddy boots if you want," he said. "You'll still be the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." She laughed then, the sound light and new in the morning air. And together, they walked back toward the house, the sun rising behind them, the creek whispering its way across the land. The wedding was quiet. It took place under the cottonwoods, where the creek now ran with a steady trickle, clear and full from the rains. A traveling circuit preacher passing through from Lewistown agreed to stop for the ceremony. Holden offered him a meal and a place to rest his horse. Beatrice baked bread the evening before, her hands steady as she kneaded, her thoughts focused and calm. She wore a dress she'd sewn from muslin Holden had found in a crate behind the general store. It wasn't white, it was the soft brown of barley in late summer, but she'd stitched blue thread through the hem and cuffs, small wildflowers curling in a quiet pattern. She walked barefoot through the grass because she wanted to feel the earth beneath her. Holden shaved for the first time in weeks. He wore a clean shirt and the same boots he'd worn into town the day he found her. His hair was combed back, still damp from the basin. The preacher spoke plainly. A few phrases from the book of Ruth. No long sermon. No audience but the trees and the wind and the horses grazing nearby. Afterward, Holden laced his fingers through hers and looked at her like he was learning the shape of peace. Beatrice didn't cry. She didn't need to. The quiet joy in her chest was enough. That night they shared the same bed, the small one she'd slept in alone since arriving. There was no urgency in them, only a slow, careful reverence. He undid the buttons of her dress like he was unwrapping something sacred. She ran her fingers over the scar beneath his ribs, the one the war left behind, and kissed it without speaking. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of their life settled deeper. Beatrice began teaching 2 afternoons a week. The Garland children walked in from their homestead, their oldest daughter carrying the slate board she'd been given as a gift in exchange for eggs. Beatrice taught under the open sky, using a flat rock for her notes, her skirts dusted with prairie grass. Holden built her a bench near the garden, where she could sit in the evenings and mend or read. She didn't ask for it. One morning it was simply there, smoothed and sanded, placed just where the light hit in the late hours before dusk. One evening, she found Holden on the porch, whittling a length of pine. "What are you making?" she asked, brushing dirt from her hands. He tilted the shape toward her. "Looks like a dog now, but I meant it to be a mule." She laughed. "I suppose it depends which end you're looking at." He set the carving down and reached for her hand. "I was thinking we should build something more permanent for your teaching. A small house. Just enough for a table and a stove. We'd use it in winter." She sat beside him, folding her hands in her lap. "You already do so much." "I want it," he said. "You've made this place feel like more than soil and timber." The wind moved across the plain, warm and dry. Beatrice watched the sky begin to color. "I dreamed of this once," she said. "Not the land or the house, but the quiet. The way a day ends without fear." Holden turned to her, his voice low. "You have it now." She rested her head against his shoulder. "I know." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. Later, when the stars came out and the lantern in the window flickered soft, they stood at the edge of the porch. Beatrice leaned into him, her palms spread over his chest. Behind them, the house stood steady. Ahead, the land stretched wide and open. And between it all, the life they were shaping slow, true, and made entirely of their choosing. The first frost came early that year, quiet and fine across the grass, and Beatrice woke to find a thin glaze of white on the garden rose. She stood at the window in her shawl, watching the sun edge over the hill and melt the silver away. Holden had already gone outside, the sound of his boots crunching over the porch boards drifting faintly through the walls. She found him near the barn, rubbing down the mule and checking the latch on the grain bin. He looked up as she approached, his breath clouding in the chill. "Frost took the last of the beans," she said, pulling her shawl tighter. He brushed his hands clean on his trousers. "We'll put up a cold frame next year. There's time to plan it right." She stepped closer, her hands settling in the crook of his elbow. "You always think 2 steps ahead." He looked at her, a small crease at the edge of his eyes. "I've got something to protect now." Beatrice leaned into him for a moment, then turned toward the pasture. "The Garland children won't come again until spring. Their father rode up yesterday with a jar of honey and said they'd be kept close to home once the snow set in." "You'll miss teaching?" She nodded. "But I've been thinking of drawing up lessons. Something the mothers can use through winter." Holden's gaze lingered on her a little longer. Then he lifted his hand and brushed a bit of hay from her shoulder. "You've made a difference here, whether you see it or not." That afternoon, they worked side by side in the root cellar, stacking what remained of the onions and squash, wrapping apples and cloth scraps from her sewing basket. The scent of damp earth and wood hung heavy, and when Holden lit the lantern, the warm glow caught in his hair. Beatrice caught herself watching his hands as he worked steady, broad, careful with everything he touched. Later, as the sun dipped west, she took out the letter she hadn't burned. The one from Claiborne Wicks, still folded in the bottom of her trunk. She read it once more, slow and quiet, then carried it outside and fed it to the stove. The flame took it fast, curling the edges into ash. She didn't mention it to Holden, but that night, when he pulled her close in bed and rested his hand over her heart, she let herself breathe deeper. By December, Holden had begun cutting timber from the pine stand east of the house. He said little about it, but she noticed him measuring the slope near the barn, marking the ground with small stakes and twine. One morning, while she kneaded bread, he came in and set a folded sheet of paper on the table. "I sketched a plan," he said, brushing snow from his collar. "For the schoolhouse. Just enough room for a stove, a few benches, and a window facing south." She wiped her hands and unfolded the paper. His lines were careful, not perfect, but full of thought. "You want to build it this winter? If the snow stays light. Otherwise come spring." She reached across the table and touched his wrist. "You're building more than a school." He met her eyes. "I know." The snow came heavy in January. They spent long hours by the fire, Beatrice darning socks and mending seams while Holden carved small figures from scrapwood animals, mostly, and once a set of letters she could use for teaching. Some nights they played checkers. Other nights they read aloud from the few books she'd brought west. One evening, as she poured water into the basin, she turned to find Holden watching her with a softness she hadn't seen before. "What is it?" she asked. "I never pictured a life like this," he said. "But now I can't imagine anything else." She crossed the room, water forgotten, and placed her hand against his cheek. "Then we'll hold on to it. Whatever comes." They kissed slowly, the firelight flickering across the walls, and when he lifted her into his arms, it wasn't with urgency, but with the deep, quiet knowing of a man who'd waited his whole life for this kind of belonging. By the time thaw came, the land was ready again, and so were they. Holden finished the schoolhouse by midsummer. He set the final plank in place the day before Beatrice's birthday. She stood beside him as he hung the simple wooden sign she had painted herself, Creekside School. The Garland children returned, and others followed. Beatrice taught 3 afternoons a week while Holden tended the ranch and checked the fence lines. In the evenings they sat on the bench he'd built, her head against his shoulder, his arm around her waist, the world slowing down to match their breath. In October, she felt the first flutter beneath her ribs, a life neither of them had spoken about, but both had quietly hoped for. She told Holden while they shelled beans on the porch. He didn't speak right away, just wrapped her hand in his and kissed her palm. A month later, he built a cradle. They named their daughter Ruth, after the words the preacher had spoken beneath the cottonwoods. She was born in the back room of the house, under a sky just beginning to snow, with Holden holding Beatrice's hand and whispering her name like a prayer. Years passed. The schoolhouse grew to hold more benches. Holden added a small porch. Ruth learned to walk between the rows of carrots and read her first words by the fire. Beatrice taught through every season, her hands always busy, her voice always calm. And Holden, steady as the land beneath them, never stopped watching her like she was the reason the sun rose. They grew older, as all people do, but their love did not lessen. It deepened, settling into their bones like something shaped by wind and time. And one morning, long after the first frost had melted from the fields, Beatrice woke early and found Holden already outside, his boots damp with dew, his back straight as he watched the sky warm. She walked out to him, still barefoot, and slid her hand into his. "Still thinking 2 steps ahead?" she asked. He shook his head, eyes on the horizon. "Just thinking how lucky I am." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Me too." And there, with the creek running soft behind them and the hills rising quiet beyond, they stood in the life they had built whole, complete, and entirely their own.